Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. Lindsay Malloy. Ah!
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Paternal Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy after?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent.
Welcome to the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Amanda Zelahusky.
And I'm Dr. Lindsay Malloy. We are two psychologists, scholars, and moms, and together we co-founded Pandemic Parenting.
We're here to share science-based research and help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together.
In this episode, we're discussing fathers and fatherhood with a focus on, to use the language preferred by our guest expert, fathers from diverse communities.
We're so grateful to have had Dr. Earl Turner join us for this conversation. Dr. Turner is a licensed psychologist and an assistant professor of psychology at Pepperdine University. His research expertise primarily focuses on mental health among racial and ethnic communities, access to behavioral health services, cultural competency, and the impact of race-based stress. He's the author of a book called Mental Health Among African Americans, Innovations in Research and Practice, and he recently founded Therapy for Black Kids, a non-for-profit organization created to help Black parents raise healthy kids in the 21st century. You can find more information about Dr. Turner and find his website in our show notes.
So in this episode, you'll hear several questions actually submitted by our listeners, and we'd love to hear from you too. So please send in your comments or questions by tweeting us at Pandemic Parent or by sending us a message through our website. The feedback and questions from fellow pandemic parents helps us determine which topics to explore or revisit here on the podcast and the other resources we have on pandemic-parent.org.
Okay, so let's get into it. Welcome to the episode. Today, we're really focused on diverse parents, thinking about parent mental health and ways to support parents in lots of different communities and contexts. So we're really thrilled to welcome Dr. Earl Turner, who is joining us today, who has lots of great experience and expertise in this area. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So we're focusing on parents, but especially dads in these conversations that we're going to have today. So one of the first things we wanted to just sort of ask, you've been working with a lot of different communities and organizations and people in the last, year and a half throughout the pandemic. So one of the things we just wanted to start off with is, what you've been observing. How do you think the pandemic has changed parenting, has changed the lives of fathers especially? And, what do you think about whether those changes are here to stay?
Yeah, I think obviously for all of us, the pandemic has changed our lives in some way. And I think that's a conversation that I've been having often over the last year in terms of how this is the first time for many of us as therapists and clinicians that we are in similar situations in our clients that we're working with in terms of navigating the pandemic and how it has impacted us. And so, one of the things that has definitely come up in some of the data that we've looked at is how parents have been impacted from a mental health perspective with the pandemic. So obviously sort of shifts with working from home for some families or going outside of home and sort of being concerned about the safety of yourself and your family has impacted many individuals and their levels of stress. But we also know that parents have also had added stressors in terms of managing those dynamics with juggling parenting. And parenting is not an easy task. And so the American Psychological Association released their annual Stress in America survey several times over the last year. And the most recent survey that came out in March of this year really looked at a little bit more in depth, what are the impacts of the pandemic on parental mental health? And so one of the things that was noted is that for a lot of parents that they've had significant struggles and difficulties with their sleep over the last year. And as we know, that impacts everything for us. And so I always talk with my clients and families about, sleep impacts our mood, sleep impacts our health. And so if you have difficulties with that, that can also impact your parenting. And so we've seen how, when looking at that data, that fathers specifically have reported more challenges and difficulties with their sleep over the last year compared to mothers. And so I think that's sort of just one data point to really demonstrate what is the impact on parents in general, but also looking at fathers.
That's so interesting. I was just talking about sleep differences and like how what moms lay awake at night thinking about, versus dads. So what do you think that's about, that dads especially are having these sleep issues?
I think one of the things that comes up often is that for many families, fathers have a lot of concerns or focus in terms of providing for the family. So those stresses and the financial things that come along with that. And so I imagine that that can be one of the factors that has contributed to why fathers may be having some difficulties with sleep, just because of the stress
Yeah.
resulted about that concern. And we know that for many people, like when you are trying to go to bed at night, that you ruminate and you constantly think about either the day that you just had or the day that you may have, coming up the next day. And so I think that has contributed to why that may be a struggle for many fathers.
And what about for kids, though, in terms of how they might have changed how they view their fathers? Have you seen that in your practice or research at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for most kids that they may have been concerned about their parents. And one thing that I think sort of sometimes surprises parents is that kids recognize things that we as adults don't maybe want them to recognize. And so I always tell parents that kids are observing you and how you interact. And so they notice when you may be stressed out, sometimes maybe more than you are willing to admit. And so I think those may be some things that have happened for kids, is really recognizing the stress that their parents may have been experiencing related to work or juggling multiple kids at home. Or trying to help them with their schoolwork when they may not understand some of the concepts. I know I've seen some of the homework of like my nieces and nephews, and like these sort of the math process. It's like, that's not how we learn how to do math. And so I think those types of things are stresses for parents as well that kids may notice.
Yes, realizing like your fifth grader has already surpassed your math intelligence and you are of no use to this child anymore. Right, exactly. Oh.
Well, and they're seeing it all now too. If like my kids have been home for the last couple of months and they were home for, much of last year. And yeah, they see everything now. There's no ability to have a meltdown really away from the kids in many ways. Like when you're all in each other's space for such a prolonged period, it's just, they're seeing more of their parents' work, more emotions, everything. So yeah, that resonates with me for sure.
Yeah. And picking up on the tension, even if you're not saying things, like they can just tell, when our moods, when we feel stressed, when we're concerned, all those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk specifically about, fathers from lots of diverse communities. I know that's a lot of the spaces that you work in. And so what are some of the challenges you've seen over the last year and a half? Many have dubbed this a dual pandemic, both COVID-19 we're dealing with, but also all the sort of civil unrest and racial violence and systemic racism, so in these spaces that you've been working, what are some of the added barriers you've seen for fathers, especially this past year?
Definitely concerns related to when you are an essential worker or a member of your home is an essential worker. And so I think that adds again to the level of stress that many fathers have maybe experienced and how they may have sort of dealt with that stress in terms of their co-parenting. And I think, for me, definitely thinking about sort of the protests and the racial injustice that has continued to occur in society. We've seen more injustice related to people of Asian descent. And so for those families, sort of recognizing that stress that comes along with that and being concerned about their elders. And so I think those are a lot of dynamics that stress people out. But I think for me, one of the sort of additional concerns and challenges that comes up is in relation to the lack of access to mental health treatment for diverse communities. And part of it is, there are systemic issues that impact access to care in terms of affordability of services, being able to locate providers in their community, being able to find providers that identify from their own ethnic and racial background. And so those are just one aspect of what can contribute to that. But then we know that for diverse communities, that they also have stigma and concerns about seeking services, and that also limits their ability to receive care. And so again, just sort of tying back to the Stress in America survey from from the American Psychological Association, they noted that only about 34% of essential workers indicated receiving treatment for mental health concerns, compared to almost 3/4 of those individuals indicating, 3 in 4 people indicating that they had some level of challenges as a result of that. So I think those are things that you definitely want to be mindful of in terms of like your own community and the people that you're interacting with, is that, somebody in your group is struggling with the mental health challenge or difficulty, even though they may not admit it to you.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of access issues, but also those stigma pieces that you mentioned. So we got so many great questions about this. I mean, one of the things that Lindsay and I really wanted to do in this conversation in particular is not in any way, assume that we know what fathers are experiencing or are worried about, and most especially fathers of many different, racial and ethnic groups. So we asked a lot of our loyal pandemic parenting listeners for their questions. And so we have some of those kind of queued up for you and really wanted you to hear right from them. And so what we're going to do is play some of these questions, and we might bounce around some different topics if that's okay. But part of that was, this is what's on the hearts and minds of, a number of fathers these days. So would really appreciate your expertise for those. Back to what you were mentioning about what may be keeping a lot of dads up at night related to this idea of being the primary breadwinner or, financial stressors in the family. So this is a question we have from Michael.
I'm a father and a husband to a stay-at-home mom. And one of the silver linings through the pandemic has been the fact that while I typically travel quite a bit for work, and I typically have a number of client events in the evenings and on weekends, none of those things happened. And therefore, I was able to spend a lot of time with my family and be very present and arguably, my wife would say, a help around the house. As things begin to open back up and as the travel is allowed, I'm starting to have a little anxiety and a little bit of hesitancy to travel again because I feel a little guilty that I'm kind of leaving them behind, that I now won't be around to help out as much. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on how to manage that, how to deal with that. I'm doing my job, I'm earning money for our family, but now I'm going back to doing it in a manner in which I won't be present in the house as much as I've been during the pandemic.
Great. Well, that's a really good question. I think that for a lot of fathers, that is something that may be a constant concern for them, particularly when fathers are the sort of primary breadwinner, or if they just work outside of the home often and may have to miss, certain milestones. I think that's a thing that we don't talk about maybe as much. I think the expectation often is that fathers have more flexibility to like miss certain things in their kids' lives as opposed to like mothers have to be there, or the expectation is that mothers have to sort of be there. And so I actually, I think it's a good idea to be able to recognize that fathers are impacted in that way and that they do want to be involved in their family and their child's lives. And sometimes it is a struggle when you have to sort of be away. So I think, the only sort of advice that really comes up for me around this is that you have to sort of figure out how you can negotiate that, hey, I want to be here, but I can't. And it sometimes breaks my heart that I can't do that. So I think that can really go a long way in terms of being able to sort of maintain that strong sense of connection with your family.
And I think too, like for those of us who've been lucky enough to work from home, and if our kids are young, especially, it's going to be hard transition for them because for over a year, it's been, okay, well, mommy's going to go work now. And that just means I'm going upstairs, into my bedroom / home office, and that they can come in anytime and, I'll be there. And they do that pretty frequently. But they may not understand too, like, well, what do you mean now work means that you have to, like, why can't you just go and do it in the basement like you used to, or do it, wherever if we're working from home. So I think that's going to be obviously like a tough transition for some.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really resonated too with, like how his wife might feel about that, right? That it's like, I've gotten used to having my husband around also, who usually travels for his job. And there's a certain cadence we've fallen into of relying on each other to do these different things. And so when that dynamic shifts also, I can appreciate and empathize with what he's worried about, that I've been able to step up in these ways, but then maybe that needs to go away. And how will we either, return to what it was before or figure out what our new normal will be?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that, that is some anxiety that many families are going to have to sort of deal with, is that it took us a while to sort of adjust to this new way of life during the pandemic, but now we have to readjust to whatever this is going to look like, as things begin to open up and we are more outside of the home. And so I think, again, you have to be really intentional to have conversations and to plan about those things. And I know that for many people, it's not how we live our lives. Like we try not to plan everything. And so I always tell people and clients when I'm working with them is that is life. Like we have to be intentional. And so for me, it's think about it as being intentional, not as like putting yourself on a schedule, because I think if we're on a schedule, yes, for many people, that can be really difficult to have those time constraints or limits on ourselves. But if you're intentional about how you navigate life, then that helps you feel much better and relieves a lot of the anxiety that you may have about those things.
Yeah. I also really like what you said about having the communication open and the dialogue, right? Like don't assume your partner knows how you're feeling or vice versa, but just because this isn't just pandemic specific, like a lot of people's jobs change throughout the course of their career and might require, more time away or a longer commute or whatever that looks like. So keeping that dialogue open for sure. At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to sharing our expertise and research in ways that are immediately accessible and useful to families. As part of our efforts to sustain and expand this work, Lindsay and I are also available for virtual speaking engagements at your business, organization, PTO, and more. We want to help you and those who you work with, grow with, and raise your children with have the chance to do so in an environment that fosters and supports your mental health. Some of the topics we enjoy speaking on include parenting during the pandemic, the impact of trauma on children and families, children's development, the mental health impact of COVID-19 on employees, and more. If you or your organization are interested in potentially collaborating, please reach out to us for availability and pricing through the Request a Speaker form on our website at www.pandemic-parent.org/contact. So this question comes from Jason.
I'm concerned with burdening my young child with the weight of racism, but I also feel compelled to provide him with the understanding and the tools to deal with prejudice and to make sure he comes home every day. Do you have any tips or suggestions?
This is probably one of the most frequent questions that I get asked in terms of how do you talk with kids about racism? Should you talk with kids about racism? And when you should start those talks, because, at some point you're going to have to do it. Part of that decision-making is that we've seen a lot of things in society over the last year. And so kids may be exposed to that either inadvertently through you watching the news, or if they're in the school system. And I think schools sometimes talk about, these issues that you are not aware of as a parent, that the teacher may sort of discuss those topics. And so I think for me, it's a matter of really making sure that parents understand that kids recognize these racial differences at a very young age. And so we've seen research showing that as young as 2, like kids recognize that people are treated differently based upon their race. And we can go back to studies that have, sort of experimentally like grouped kids in terms of like the color t-shirts that they wear and sort of talk about some of those dynamics too. But kids do recognize that. And so I think it is necessary for parents to have those conversations so that they don't learn outside of the home sort of how to do that, because, kids are looking up to their parents as the first person in their life to really show them how to live. And I know sometimes we may not think about it that way, but they do. And so I think it's important for parents to really have that conversation with their kids about race and racism, and being able to really recognize that it's not about placing a burden on your child. I think as adults, like we place so much weight on talking about race and racism compared to kids. And they are going to take their cues about this topic from you as the parent. And so if you are feeling a burden about having the conversation, yes, they're going to feel like a burden because they're going to pick up on your anxiety or your stress around the topic. And so I always recommend that for parents, take some time to prepare before you have that conversation with your child. So what are the things that you want to communicate about racism, and be comfortable with your own emotions so that way you can be authentic in your conversation around that topic. So if you are frustrated, if you are angry, if you are unsure, like let your child know that, and then you can both sort of work through those feelings together, as opposed to you trying to like pretend that you're okay, but inside you're like boiling over because you don't know, like, what is my kid going to ask me about this topic? So I think that preparation is really important. And obviously there are a lot of books that you can sort of look up and that are helpful for you to sort of talk about how to navigate that. APA has a website that looks at resilience and racial and ethnic socialization. It's oftentimes geared towards families from diverse communities, but if you go through their website, they have a lot of resources in terms of like the types of questions that you can ask kids from a developmental perspective, from a toddler all the way up through adolescents or teenagers. And they have book resources and a whole bunch of other tools that I think I usually recommend for parents to take a look at so that you can be able to see, how can I engage in this conversation with my child in a healthy way? So that way we can really talk about this topic that is oftentimes avoided. And then that also makes the child, feel like it's a bad thing to talk about race and racism.
Yeah. And we'll definitely link to all those resources you just mentioned, especially that come out of APA in the show notes. So we got a question about sort of the other extreme of this, right? So you're talking about, don't avoid the conversation. It's really important to have it. We had a dad ask about sort of if you can talk about it too much, right? Is there overkill? So let me play his question because I think it relates to the other perhaps end of that continuum you were referencing.
As a dad, I wonder if I'm doing the right thing by taking every opportunity to talk to my children about real life situations at such a young age. Part of me wonders if in doing so, I'm making them grow up too fast. The other part of me wants to make sure that I teach them about these important topics before someone else, like friends from school or Professor Google, misinform them on the topics.
So can we talk about it too much?
I mean, I don't know if you can talk about it too much. I think it is about how do you talk about it. And so I think it's the context and the conversation that you're having with your child, in that, are you giving them too much information that is not developmentally appropriate in the conversation? So you don't want to talk with the 5-year-old about the experiences that you may talk about related to racism with an adult or your colleagues at work. So I think those are the most important things to really think about, is how much information are you giving to the child in these conversations. I think it's perfectly appropriate to talk with kids as frequently as possible about racism, because that is going to be the only way that we are going to be able to encourage them to not repeat some of the things that others may have repeated in society, and really teach them about accepting diversity and people from different backgrounds and skin colors and cultures. And so I think all of those things are really important to be able to talk with kids about. But you do want to be mindful about, how much information are you giving them based upon their sort of developmental age.
So we had a few questions around the pandemic specifically and how that's impacting fatherhood. And then we also had some great questions about, disciplining kids in different ways, which I thought had some really great insights there. So, let's go next to just sort of thinking about the pandemic. And so here's a question that comes from Jesse.
How do we keep from feeling that we failed our kids through this pandemic? We didn't stay active in sports. We were lax with their schooling because of our work schedule. We locked ourselves indoors thinking we were doing right for the world, but now see it as doing wrong by our kids. Now I feel like we have to overcompensate for the lack of activity and are putting our boys in every possible thing. And we are definitely feeling stressed because we are jumping from 0 to 100.
Oh, I feel that too. Gosh. Yeah.
That I'm laughing a little because I think that oftentimes we want to get our kids involved in so many activities to get them exposed to things, but then we don't think about the the burnout pieces of it that sometimes come along with that, not just for them, but also for us, from like taking them from place to place to be able to sort of engage in these activities. And I know that my nephew, he's very involved in a lot of sports right now. Like he's juggling like football, trying to do football and also baseball at the same time. And I'm like, what is going on? So I think that, as parents, we have to think about that, not just from our own sort of scheduling perspective, but for kids too. And that you don't want to over schedule them in activities. Having that interaction with peers is definitely important. And that's something that, I've had conversations with others before about. It's going to take us some time to really understand what the impact of the pandemic is going to be on kids' social and emotional development, because they were isolated for such a long time, doing school at home, not being able to interact with their family members in terms of like cousins and family members or their peers at school. And so those are really important things that really help kids learn how to share and make friends and engage in conversation and play. And so I definitely sort of understand where this father is coming from in terms of wanting to make sure that the kid has, some tools that are going to be helpful for them throughout the rest of their lives. And so I think you want to pace yourself, like try to make a decision about what is the one thing that your kid really, really loves to do, and do that activity. I think that's going to be enough to give them some exposure to be able to have those interactions that we know are important for their development.
Yeah, because I keep wondering if we'll sort of see two groups, well, probably more than that, but one group that's like, we missed all these things and we just want to dive back in and we're going to go like 0 to 100, as the person who asked the question said. And another group that's like, whoa, this was kind of nice. Like, not having every Saturday and Sunday with baseball or hockey or whatever it is, packing throughout the whole weekend, and we have more free time and we have more quality time as a family. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it pans out if you have people who actually feel like, well, I like this lifestyle more. And others who are just eager to like, dive back into the social life.
Right. Because I think the other piece too, just to add to that, is that kids also get anxiety, and some of that may be socially related. And so I don't know, his child, but I think for some kids, like the pandemic has also been nice for them because they haven't had to deal with some of those concerns about interacting with peers or dealing with bullying. We've definitely seen where kids that were getting bullied in school have been doing much better because they were able to sort of be at home and feel safe. And so I think those are other things that we have to sort of think about that may be challenging for children as well as we sort of transition back.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think we can learn a lot about, what is it that they're getting out of these activities? Like I found myself as we start to ease back and sign them up for things, again, or re-engage in things they used to enjoy, like what is it about those activities? Was it for some of them the social pieces? And so great, mostly they are missing the connection with peers. And so maybe we can do that this way. It doesn't, but they hated the competitive part of that particular activity. So I've been thinking a lot just about how we as parents can try to really get, sort of a better sense of what it was that they are that they crave, that they missed the most about a particular activity. And, was it the physical release? Was it the peer connection? Any of those things before you dive right back into the things that your kids did before. This is a great time to sort of reset, as you were saying, Lindsay, some families might do, and think about, okay, what do you want to do, kiddo? We don't have to go right back to the sports you did last spring just because that's what you did. Let's really think about, what do you want to do? Maybe you want to try something new. So I do think there's something about these breaks sometimes that can help us reorient and not just do the same things we always do in the spring every year. I've been having a hard time reorienting schedule wise. So like my kids are each back in baseball, and you think about what our weekends used to look like, right? Scheduled every hour, like you were talking about, Earl. And now it's like when one kid has a 1 hour practice, my mind is so used to the pandemic that I'm like, well, great, there goes the whole weekend shot, because, we have something from 11 to 12 on Saturday. And it's like, whoa, remember what our weekends used to look like? So it's hard for us to ease back. I don't know if there is an easing back into that or what that looks like, but.
Yeah. I mean, you have to ease yourself back into it.
Yeah. And your kids too, right? They might not want to, like you said, jump back into all this stuff, or the opposite, or they're saying, put me back in all these things. And the parents are like, no, it was so nice to have nothing on Saturday. So So yeah, for sure. So let's talk about some of those, I guess, those disconnects, right? We had some of these discipline questions. One of them I thought was really great that has to do with thinking about, the way that we discipline our kids may be related to how we were disciplined. And I know that this comes up a lot, especially depending on just sort of cultural norms in your family or how discipline is viewed. So let me play this one for you.
How do I handle my teenager's mood swings without resorting to the same tactics, methods, discipline that my parents used on me while still achieving the same results?
This is a tough question because I think part of it is like, what is causing the mood swings? I think there's a huge belief about how kids have, particularly teenagers, have these mood swings because of that transitional period for them, and that they're going to be a little bit more irritable. We know hormones changes occur, and so that often sort of relates to some of those mood swings as well. But the other piece for me is really trying to understand, like, is there something related to mental health that may be contributing to the mood swings? And so I think for parents, I always recommend that, if you notice that your child's mood is significantly changing, that you want to be able to go get help and go talk to a psychologist or a therapist who can evaluate if there is a mental health, challenge that is going on. Because I think oftentimes we just make the assumption that, hey, they're just being irritable right now. They're annoyed with me. They're annoyed with school. I'm going to let them have their feelings at this moment without really thinking about, is there something that's deeper that's going on? And so I usually encourage people to really think about, we have a focus on health and getting screenings to sort of check out how we're doing physically from a health perspective, but we don't do like a check-in for our mental health. And so I think it's useful for us to really think about it in that manner, to say, hey, let's go get a checkup. Let's go to a therapist. Let's see, hey, what's going on? Can we get some tools if there are some things that we need to maybe do differently? But the other lens may be that maybe the child may be sort of emerging to develop, a mental health diagnoses that may need to be treated differently with medication or continued therapy. And so I think those are things that we want to be considerate of as parents when particularly when a child is having these sort of mood swings or difficulties that are lasting for a long time. Like, it's definitely appropriate for a teenager or any child for that matter to like have a mood swing based upon a situation, an event that has occurred. But if this mood swing is lasting, up and down for weeks or months, we may want to have them, see someone to just make sure that nothing more serious is going on in terms of a diagnosis.
And adolescence is just such a hard time to figure that out, right? Because we tend to assume, like you said, oh, this is just a mood swing, or this is puberty, this is just what happens, versus, dismissing or figuring out, okay, we're at that point. Let's figure out if that's what's going on, or it is something else.
Moving targets, I remember reading in one article. But yeah, and I think discipline in relation to mood swings. I mean, I guess I just want to know more, right? Like, is it that the mood swings are leading the teenager to be, verbally abusive to family members or something, or something else? Like, that seems like it'd be really key to find out, because in and of itself, having a mood swing wouldn't necessarily mean like that discipline, was required or necessary or what have you, but it depends on what's happening. Like, are they striking younger siblings or something? Because that's a very different situation or result of a mood swing. So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's hard to answer these types of questions without that additional context.
Yeah, I know. And we don't know the discipline strategies that he said that his parents use that he doesn't want to use. We don't know anything about those either. Right. So yeah, that definitely something I thought about. But
yeah, we had a similar question come from a dad of a biracial son around sort of thinking about discipline, but also what kind of standards we hold our kids to. So let me pull that one up.
I find myself being overly firm with my son because I know from experience that he will be held to a different standard. Do you have any recommendations of ways to avoid projecting my anxiety and misgivings onto him?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, this sort of goes back to part of the conversation that we were having earlier around sort of racial dynamics in society. So I think that you don't want to hold your child to a different standard per se, but I think it's definitely appropriate and necessary to have a talk with them about how society may treat them differently or hold them up to different expectations. So I think it's about having that balance in terms of socialization of the child who is biracial to really understand that in certain spaces you may be treated differently. So how can you handle that? The piece that is missing sometimes with these conversations with parents is that we talk with them about racism or their potential to experience racism or be treated differently, but we don't give them the tools or talk with them about how to navigate those situations.
Right.
So I think that is the really important piece for this parents to really think about, is that, hey, let's talk about a situation where if you go into the mall or whatever as a teenager, that you may be watched by the store clerk. Like, what should you do in that situation? So that may be something that's really helpful, as opposed to telling your kid, like, when we go out, I want you to do this behavior, and really being strict. I want you to stay next to me, XYZ, which then may make the kid be more concerned and internalize some of these negative messages that society has about them based upon their skin color. So I think that's the piece to really consider, is that how do you teach your child how to navigate these potential situations that they may experience in their childhood, but also as they become an adult.
I think that's so key. And I love that across so many different ways we are trying to teach our kids things, right? We can't just tell them what not to do. We have to give them options for what they can do in those situations. So I think that's really helpful. So special thanks to all these great dads who sent in these questions, and just really appreciated their honesty and vulnerability. So I think we just have a couple sort of broader questions for you as we kind of wrap up, and, give a virtual high five to all the dads out there trying so hard to do a good job. So just sort of in general, and this kind of relates to the last question we got, how can fathers build resilience in their children? And I think related to that probably is also, how can they build resilience in themselves?
Yeah. One thing that I've talked a lot about over the last couple of years is that society has these different standards towards boys and men in relation to how they express the range of their emotions. And so I think part of that is, these masculinity norms about being tough all the time, not being able to express sadness or anxiety or worries or fears in situations. And so I think as a way to sort of promote and help boys be more resilient, that fathers also need to be more open with their own emotions and feelings, so that they know that it's okay for me to express those types of emotions, and I don't have to be tough all the time, or that the only emotion that I can't express is anger, which tends to be a very acceptable emotion for boys and men, for us to sort of be upset, to yell, to throw things or break things or punch things, but we can't cry. And so I think those things are hard, because let's say if your child does want to cry about something or to be sad, is that now they can also begin to feel bad about having those emotions and try to shield themselves from those experiences. And we know that internalizing those emotions can be toxic for you and leads to more difficulty. So I think that's one of the most helpful ways that fathers can really model for their sons how to be resilient, but also to let them know that it's okay to struggle sometimes, to get help or to talk about those things, because ultimately that does help you to be more resilient and to handle all of the challenges that you're going to face in life.
Yeah.
Excellent. So this is a really big question, but it'll be our final question. So how can we better support fathers? So if we think about what kind of policy changes we might like to see going forward that would help families, but especially fathers, and in terms of fatherhood. So what sorts of policy changes do you think would be useful?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that there have been a lot of conversations about is around paternity leave. I have a friend and colleague who recently sort of disclosed to me that they were going to have to return to work very quickly after they had a newborn. And so I think for mothers, there's a lot of flexibility for moms to be at home, 6 months to a year in some situations when they have a kid, but dads don't really get that time. And so I think that's something that can be really helpful for fathers. And it goes back to a point that the other father mentioned earlier in terms of the guilt that fathers may experience. So I think that can go a huge way in terms of changing up some of those things. And then I think, again, I think a lot of things that need to change for how we socialize boys at a very young age about emotional intelligence, that we need to change that as well. And that's a conversation that I've had, several times over the last couple of years. We're really talking about it would be really helpful for schools to do a much better job in how we sort of allow kids to learn about using their emotional vocabulary and coping skills and those types of things, where we don't consistently do that in schools. Some schools are much better at offering those types of tools, but it's not something that's integrated throughout the school system. And so I think it would be really helpful to do that, because then that's a skill, that's a life skill that we all need. And so we expect people to like go through life, maybe get some of these tools from their parents as they're growing up, but ultimately you have to figure it out on your own about how to sort of express and manage your emotions. And I think that that's one of the things that is a downfall about the education system.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to see that. It would be amazing. I have a son who just turned 6, and I see, him and his friends experience a wide range of emotions, and they're like physically affectionate with each other, and, all sorts of things that I just look and I think in a couple of years, they're not going to think, I hope, and we continue to try to teach them, but when they learn from peers and TV and all sorts of other things will be that, that's not appropriate anymore for them. And I just hope that we can get to that point sooner rather than later. So
It comes a lot. Yeah, exactly. I was sort of thinking about how, this episode will be released around Father's Day, and so did you have any message you wanted to offer to any of the fathers out there listening?
For me, it's really important that you make sure that you make time for yourself. And I think that's a thing that fathers don't always have opportunities to do. That is because you're so involved in work or with your family that you don't get that time that you need for yourself. And I think that we all need that time. And I think especially fathers, to make sure that you do get some time to just sort of be with yourself. And that's healing and helpful for us to be able to do. So try to be intentional again about that, and make sure that you get that time, even if it's only like 15 to 20 minutes. And I know that for parents, that can be a lot sometimes, or sometimes it may seem like a little, but I think we don't always have to have an hour or a full day to ourselves. I think that those brief moments can be helpful to sort of restore us.
I remember one comedian talking about the little vacation that you get when you buckle your kid into the car on one side and you close the door, and then you walk around to the front seat, and you get that 40-second vacation. So sometimes it doesn't take a lot, just a moment
That
of
is
peace.
So true.
Absolutely.
I don't have to chase anybody for 10
and you're
seconds.
I can't even hear them if they're screaming at me right now and asking me for a snack. I can't even hear them in that little walk around to the front of the car. Yes.
Well, I think I'm going to move my kid's car seat. That's great advice. To the other side.
You can always do a little lap around your car either way.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much. This was really excellent. And we know that there has been a lot of focus on parents, and maybe rightfully so, because we know that moms have taken on sort of a disproportionate burden from the pandemic, but there hasn't been a lot of focus or a lot of articles, we're hearing from our friends and colleagues and relatives who are dads focusing on dads. So we're really happy that you could join us and put that focus on dads and their mental health as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you for having me here.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. Make sure to hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening on to be notified of future episodes. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you'll find us. Or follow the links in the show notes.
Let us know what you think of this episode by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your 5-star review helps us move up the charts to reach even more parents and caregivers. If you have a specific question or topic you'd like us to address in a future episode, let us know. You can email info@pandemic-parent.org and mention podcast in the subject line.
And this podcast isn't all we do, by the way. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive
extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org.
Lastly, this show wouldn't be possible without supporters like you. Lindsay and I donate our time to this podcast, but we do have an incredible team working behind the scenes to make this all happen. If you'd like to support the show beyond leaving your 5-star review, visit www.pandemic-parent.org/support and donate today.
Thanks for listening. Hope you can join us next time.